today we're actually going to be talking about something that doesn't always show up as burnout, but feels just as heavy. And so the question at hand is, how do you overcome a sense of unfulfillment at work? You might be competent, you might be successful, you might even be well compensated, and yet something still feels off. You're not in crisis, you're not failing, but you're also not energized either. You may feel flat, restless, disconnected, and maybe even quietly resentful. And then the thought creeps in, shouldn't I feel better than this? So let's unpack this in a structured way, because unfulfillment at work is rarely random, right? So success and fulfillment are really not the same thing. And many high performers are trained to pursue metrics, essentially. They're trained to pursue title or compensation or influence or recognition or growth. And so these are achievement markers. Fulfillment is different. Fulfillment answers questions like, does this align with who I am? Does this work use my strengths? Does this matter to me? You can hit every external metric and still feel internally misaligned. If your work reflects competence but not identity, you'll feel capable but also empty. And so you might be operating in a role and not in alignment. So this is subtle but also very powerful. And so there's a difference between I'm good at this and this feels like me. And sometimes unfulfillment isn't about the job itself. It's about living inside a role that no longer fits your evolving identity. So you might have actually outgrown the pace, the mission, the leadership style, the culture, the impact level. And so when identity evolves, but your environment doesn't, misalignment will ultimately create a friction. And friction over time feels like dissatisfaction. Interestingly, chronic stress, as I've talked about it with many, masks as unfulfillment. And so sometimes what you're labeling as unfulfilled is actually fatigue or nervous system fatigue, decision overload, lack of recovery, emotional depletion. And when your system is constantly activated, joy becomes inaccessible. You don't feel inspired, you actually feel more drained. And drained people don't experience meaning clearly. So before you overhaul your career, right? So I want you to ask yourself, am I misaligned or am I exhausted? Because the interventions are different. You've been achieving, but not integrating, essentially. And so what does that mean? It means that if you live in a constant forward motion, like what's the next quarter look like? What's the next promotion? What's the next expansion? Next acquisition, or even the next milestone. You don't pause long enough to ask, is this actually satisfying? And so high achievement without reflection leads to identity drift. You wake up 5 years later thinking, how did I end up here? Unfulfillment often signals a lack of intentional recalibration. And you're underutilizing core strengths. Fulfillment increases when your natural abilities are engaged, your decision-making matters, your input shapes outcomes, your values are expressed. And so if your role essentially limits autonomy, creativity, or meaningful contribution, you'll ultimately feel constrained. And prolonged constraint feels like suffocation, not motivation. And so you're working from obligation and not choice, essentially. Early in careers, obligation drives growth, right? And later in careers, choice must replace obligation. So if your internal narrative sounds like I have to, I should, this is what's expected, I can't leave, I'm too far in, then ultimately you're likely operating from a fear place and not intention. And so essentially, fulfillment requires agency. Even if you stay in the same role, you must psychologically shift from I'm trapped to what else? So I'm trapped to, I lost my train of thought there. But anyway, so if you do stay in the same role, right, it's important that you come to terms with I'm closing this window for now, essentially, and the shift alone, I think, will restore power ultimately. And so if you're confusing comfort with growth, that sometimes happens, right? And so sometimes unfulfillment is not misalignment, it's actually stagnation. And so if you're no longer challenged, or let's say you're learning or experiencing or expanding, leading at a higher level, essentially, your system's going to crave growth, right? And so competence without expansion is going to ultimately lead to boredom. And boredom in high performers often feels like emptiness, essentially. And so the solution may not be quitting, it may be actually expanding your scope and taking on maybe some new strategic challenges, and maybe even developing some new competencies, right? So you haven't defined what meaning means to you. Many professionals will end up chasing it, like these industry-defined successes, right? As we mentioned before. And few define personal meaning, right? So, ask yourself, what impact actually matters to me? And what kind of problems do I want to solve? It may even come down to who or what do I want influence, and what kind of leader do I actually want to be? And so if you've never consciously defined meaning, you might be living in really someone else's success script, which is interesting to think about in and of itself. And borrowed scripts seldom bring joy or even like just a sense of satisfactory long-term, right? Internal satisfaction long-term. So the question, right? So how do I overcome the sense of unfulfillment? Well, one, don't start with your resignation letter. So I think that's important to start with. Really, what you need to start with is clarity. So step one is clarity, and it's differentiating exhaustion from misalignment. Step two would be to clarify your current identity, not who you are 5 years ago, but more importantly, we'll get into that second notion. But step three is assessing your environment, right? So is there room for adaptation? Can you renegotiate your scope? Can you increase autonomy? Can you align your role more strategically, with your strengths, essentially? And so sometimes fulfillment, returns through this kind of redesign, and sometimes through recalibration, and sometimes through transition. And so, give me 1 second here. There we go. But impulsive decisions, which is also a form of decision that we want to avoid, made from an emotional place of depletion, will ultimately create some regret. So the hard question I ask you, right, is if nothing changed in your current role, let's say for 3 years, would you feel proud of the direction that you're heading? And if the answer is essentially no, then the discomfort you feel is actually information. And so it's not failure, it's actually information. And so before we close, I have 3 reflection questions that I always like to pose for folks who are listening. So early in your dissatisfaction about meaning, think about, is your energy essentially depleted, or is your dissatisfaction about really what you're doing in the role that you're in, right? Right. And so the second question is, are you choosing your current role, or are you simply tolerating it? And the third question is, does your work reflect who you are now, or who you were when you accepted it, right? The 5 years ago. And so essentially, unfulfillment, again, is not weakness. It's often a signal that your identity is evolving faster than your professional environment. And that's not something to panic about, right? It's actually something to examine thoughtfully. And so if anything I talked about today resonates with you, the listener, especially for those of you in leadership or high-performing environments, I explore and identify an alignment type of dynamics more deeply in my practice, in my coaching practice, but also you can find more information on my YouTube channel as well as LinkedIn. Because, right, so the staple here is that professional success without psychological alignment eventually destabilizes performance. And when identity and strategy align, fulfillment can become sustainable. Thanks again for listening.